Fake it till you make it. It's something we hear all the time, an idea that is framed as innocent, that we can embellish our skill set or past experiences so we can get a foot in the door and really prove what we can do. Or in the case of a new business venture, so we can get the funding we're asking for. But there's a fine line between embellishment and misrepresentation. Our guest has studied how startup culture and economics encourage exaggeration and even outright deception. He's here to explain how even well-meaning entrepreneurs fall into these traps and to share how they can do better. Kyle Jensen is the Director of Entrepreneurship and an Associate Dean at the Yale School of Management. Along with Stanford's Tom Byers, Laura Dunham of the University of St. Thomas, and John Fjeld of Duke, he wrote the HBR article, Entrepreneurs and the Truth. Kyle, thanks so much for joining me.
Kurt, it's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I love a simple headline like that, Entrepreneurs and the Truth. It's very clear.
Is it? Yes. And in truth, the truth is sometimes lacking in entrepreneurship, unfortunately.
Why is it that way?
Yeah, well, it's complicated. The most important reason is that entrepreneurs are always on, more than anybody else. Entrepreneurs start with nothing. They're building a dream, a castle in the sky, something in which no one else believes, and they have to be passionate advocates for their projects all the time. It is an endeavor that requires unwavering confidence. There's some good reasons for that. Even as an investor or an employee or another stakeholder associated with an entrepreneurial venture, I would say, look, if the founder doesn't believe in this, why should I? Right? So there's this impetus, this need for the founder to be wholly in, to project great confidence. And investors seek that out. People seek it out. If I'm going to join your startup company, I don't want to see you vacillating or uncertain or filled with doubt. I feel comforted by your unwavering confidence.
Right.
And the danger for entrepreneurs is that enthusiasm and confidence creeps into falsity, fraud, in the extremes.
I remember hearing one time that somebody said an entrepreneur is kind of somewhere between like failure and crushing it.
Yeah, you're right that there are entrepreneurs mostly in those two extremes. So the act of entrepreneurship has a little bit of a different statistical distribution of outcomes than most things. So say I went into consulting or some kind of salary job. I have some chance of making millions of dollars, but I can't really make billions of dollars, right? If you want to be a billionaire, there's pretty much only one thing you can do in this world, and that's become an entrepreneur. But most people don't make it, right? Most entrepreneurs never become billionaires. So they're kind of stuck in these two extremes. And this is actually the second reason that entrepreneurs are sometimes guilty of bending the truth. And that's that there's just a lot at stake. A million things need to go right. And you are juxtaposed between sometimes destitution and failure of your families and friends and the people who believed in you. And on the other hand, great wealth. Under such conditions, sometimes the truth suffers. And the final one is information asymmetry, which means that I, as the entrepreneur, I have a lot more information about my venture than you do, Kurt. I know a lot. You know very little. I want your money, and I can leave things out. I can paint an overly rosy picture, and you really have no way of figuring out what information I have. And that's more true for a startup than it is for something like a public company where they're making public filings, and everyone can see what last quarter's revenue was and things like this.
Yeah. Now, you're an entrepreneur yourself, right? You started and ran several ventures before you went into academia. And I'm just curious what your personal experience with that was.
Actually, I'm a little bit like in our HBR paper, we talk about the founder of Stonyfield. And I have to say my own behavior as an entrepreneur it's kind of similar to his. There are times when I have stretched the truth, where I felt pressured to, or just allowed someone to labor under some false belief, right? Maybe I'm talking to an investor, or I was talking to an investor as an entrepreneur, and maybe that investor wasn't fully aware that something had been tried before, or that some competitor exists, and I allow them to remain unaware, or I paint just the best possible picture of my venture. That's a very common way of thinking about what entrepreneurs should do, is that I'm going to paint the best possible picture. That's my duty, and your duty as the investor is right to do your due diligence and all this kind of stuff. So I definitely felt a pressure as an entrepreneur. I can remember times in which I felt like I was loose with the truth, and I don't feel awesome about it.
Yeah. Gary Hirschberg, who built Stonyfield Farm, into this big national success, he was somebody who just talked about, getting through some crisis points in the company by essentially misrepresenting to vendors a bit. His argument was that vendors kind of priced that in a little bit. They were sort of expecting some of that, or knew that
Hmm.
that he was presenting things in a certain way. But you also look at cases like Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. She's alleged to have really created a reality distortion field around the product.
First, I wanted to interject too. You're right that we do talk about a few of these entrepreneurs you mentioned in the HBR paper, and Gary Hirschberg is miles away, not even close to. I mean, he's a regular entrepreneur and a great philanthropist, and which is just a very different thing. I pick on him because he did an incredible job of articulating the pressures that entrepreneurs go through, and the rationalizations that they have for some of the deceptions involved. But
Yeah.
there's a very different thing, of course, than what Elizabeth Holmes is doing,
Or is
or
accused
did,
of
or is
doing.
accused
Yeah, yeah.
of. Yes, is accused of doing, which is straight up lies about the technology, which is in a space where it has real harms, right? So she's selling bogus tests that she knows to be bogus, according to the reporting in Bad Blood. And there's some discussion in the book that seems to suggest that she's thinking eventually everything will be okay. So this will all be for the greater good in the end. I just need to kind of lie my way through this lull.
You talked about the rationalization there. Gary Hirschberg talked about rationalizing, some of the things he did at certain times to get the company forward. That speaks somehow to the bending of the truth in the startup world, being common, even though it may manifest itself, very differently.
I think you're right that it is common. And you touched on earlier a point that maybe as entrepreneurs we can say to ourselves, "Oh, this is the norm in entrepreneurship." Or investors are big boys and girls and they're responsible for their own due diligence, or each party knows the rules of the game. So maybe lying in entrepreneurship, or similar kinds of behaviors like obfuscation or omission of what, maybe that's just a rule, just like bluffing is allowed in poker. We don't consider bluffing a violation. We expect it. And maybe entrepreneurs can think of lying in entrepreneurship or obfuscation or exaggeration or whatever as just like bluffing. But ultimately, I don't think that holds water. I think that, which is to say, we probably almost certainly have an ethical obligation to each other to actually tell the truth. Now, I should say, this form of thinking is called ethical relativism, where you think, oh, in this domain, what's ethical is just what people do.
Besides ethical relativism, like what are the rationales? What are the ways that people rationalize things that they have to do or feel they have to do?
So the first is ethical relativism. So I would say, oh, investors are big boys and girls, and this is just like bluffing in poker. Everyone does it. Everyone knows that you can lie about your market size. The other is to say, well, this is for the greater good. So you might say, look, it doesn't behoove my investors, or maybe it's in their interest for me to deceive them briefly because the company is going to work out and they're make billions or something like this, right? Or I lie about the efficacy of a drug because ultimately I believe it's going to work. And this is somewhat of the rationale that you can kind of pick up Holmes having in the reporting on Theranos. And the third is a partiality. So this is something akin to our concept of shareholder capitalism. So I, as the entrepreneur, I am responsible for my shareholders, my stakeholders, the people who've invested in me, and everyone else I'm not responsible for. So my ethical obligation and what defines right and wrong is doing what's in the best interest of those people and not anybody else. And so Hirschberg touches on this and says, look, we had our families, our friends, they had put money into this company. And if I didn't do my damnedest, even if that damnedest meant telling a fib here and there, then I wasn't doing my duty. And a lot of entrepreneurs feel that because it is crushing to have taken money from people who put their trust in you and to fail. Because earlier, it's likely the case that you presented to them a rosy picture, a future, an enthusiastic future for the company. And so you're very afraid of failing. And so you're willing to go to great lengths to protect these people, even if that means hurting other people. And so we would call that partiality as another justification.
That's so interesting because it's almost like one rosy embellishment begets the pressure to deceive again.
Yeah, I think there's definitely truth in what you say, but it is complicated. So I might, for example, paint an incredibly rosy picture, and then add as a second an afterthought. The caveats, right? This is the fine print to the contract. This is the fast speaking individual telling you about side effects at the end of a drug commercial, right? And a lot of times that's the nature of the discussion that we have in entrepreneurship. So I tell you the best, and then oh yes, but by the way, startups are risky, and so on and so forth. And so this you might say is like inadequate consent. Imagine, for example, I'm an entrepreneur, and I am, of course, starting some fantastic new company, which of course is risky because it's new, and I'm speaking with a would-be employee, and I expect this employee to quit her job, to move her family across the coast, to take some lower salary on the promise of leadership opportunities and going public in the future and things like this. And I want to recruit her, but at the same time, I really have an obligation to make sure she's fully informed about the riskiness of the endeavor. And a lot of people, of course, in that situation, that person probably doesn't have startup experience and doesn't truly understand how risky startups are.
It's also interesting because, I mean, move fast and break things is a phrase we know. And Uber, when it started, right, there wasn't really a legal framework for ride sharing. So there are a lot of startups that kind of get going by breaking laws. There's also a reverence in startups for not following, the boring processes and the rules. And so there are great things about doing that, and there are terrible things about breaking laws and doing harm. It's a really tricky stomping ground.
I think let's say take the case of Uber. So Uber, I agree, did some very distasteful things early on, including, for example, reportedly designing software that would evade tracking by law enforcement and running a rideshare operation in jurisdictions where it was unapproved. And I think a large part of that rationalization is that, well, this law is unjust.
Yeah, and
right?
misinformed.
Misinformed. Yes, misinformed. Now, yes, right. So you're right. You're absolutely right, Kurt. So it's an argument, and it's a self-serving argument for the greater good, that the world is going to be better if you didn't have this law and with our ride sharing. So we're just going to launch this ride sharing, even though it's against the law. And they are right that not all things that are legal are ethical, and not all things that are illegal are unethical.
Yeah.
And of course, we've had many unjust, unethical laws in our country for some time. But Martin Luther King, of course, famously, who wrote about ethics, he said that there were some laws that were so unjust that it called for violating them. Now, I don't think that local taxi cab laws rise to that ethical level, right? So I really do think it was a wrong thing for Uber to do, to operate in these jurisdictions where it was illegal. And then you have to wonder, what is the lesson that employees derive from a company's willingness to do something that is illegal and potentially unethical, right? So one thing I could take away from that as an employee is that, well, rules don't matter. And then you might ask yourself, what does that contribute to the early unfriendly culture within Uber that led to the ouster of the CEO, the founding CEO?
Let's talk a little bit about the harm of this, because we've really talked about the motivations and rationalizations of entrepreneurs to put a good face on things and will a company forward. Where does it come back to bite them? What goes wrong?
Actually, I don't think it often does come back to bite entrepreneurs. There's a handful of people who become known as shysters or serial liars, or who got out over their skis too far. But honestly, I do not think it is the case that entrepreneurs often face the consequences of deception. Now, there are consequences, but those consequences I don't think are faced by the entrepreneurs themselves. Who would face consequences? I gave you an example earlier of me hiring someone and being super enthusiastic. Any entrepreneur whose company has gone belly up can tell you about people that they wooed to their company who made large decisions and were fired when the company went belly up. And these people really can be really affected by exaggeration or falsity or untruths. Same is true of early stage angel investors, of course, people who participate in friends, fools, and families rounds, these so-called triple F rounds. To a lesser degree, professional investors, but not always to their exclusion. If you look at who is invested in Theranos, of course, these are very professional, sophisticated people.
It also sounds like maybe the system isn't really set up to disincentivize or turn away bad actors, right? But we're also recognizing that a lot of entrepreneurs go into their ventures with good intentions. So maybe we can talk about some specific things that individuals in these situations can do to avoid lying or put some of their optimism in appropriate context in a way that is kind of honorable and meaningful.
So one of the things we talk about in the paper is just telling people, showing people your data. To show, don't tell. And we articulate this in terms of a conclusion sandwich. So let's say, for example, I want to convince you of the rosy prospects for the next fiscal year. I might say, sales are going to be gangbusters, which is my conclusion. That's the top of the sandwich. Then I'm going to put here in my data here, I would say we collected this data, or we show this growth in this sector. We're selling this much of this product, and we're doing this acquisition here, whatever. And then I would conclude with my conclusion again. And so I think sales are going to be gangbusters. So what am I doing there? Well, one, I'm making sure I communicate the point that I want you, Kurt, to take away from my oration, which is sales are going to be gangbusters. But I'm also, at the same time, giving you the data you need to be critical of that conclusion. So you might reach a different conclusion. This, I think, is an easy way for entrepreneurs to have their cake and eat it too. I'm going to be persuasive, but I'm also going to be honest. Now, the hard part with that is you don't necessarily have that much time, right? That doesn't really fit into an elevator pitch. And so you have to be a little bit sensitive as an entrepreneur who wants to be honest to what context you're in. So maybe if I'm at a cocktail party or in an elevator, giving the cliche elevator pitch, I have only time for the positive and not the caveats, not the minutia. But in contexts where I could reasonably, as an entrepreneur, expect people to make important decisions based on what I'm saying, I really need to fill in that middle portion with data that allows the investor, the customer, the would-be employee to make an informed decision on their own.
Yeah.
We'll call that the conclusion sandwich. Your data are wrapped in the conclusion twice.
What other strategies can you employ?
Yeah, I think the simplest thing is to choose people. It sounds so simple. I feel silly saying it. To choose people who behave in the way that you want yourself to behave. So if you surround yourself with charlatans, with people who are willing to talk out of their rear end, you're going to end up doing that a lot yourself. But if you surround yourself with people who are honest, who have high moral standards, who are willing to say the difficult thing when it's difficult, then you're going to be more apt to do that. And I think for entrepreneurs, the most important people in that demographic are investors. One of the things that I really lament about entrepreneurship is, as an entrepreneur, you only get a few at-bats, right? Maybe you start, even the best entrepreneurs, just a handful of companies. You raise money a handful of times. You have a handful of acquisitions. But investors, boy, they do that all the time, right? They see so many scenarios. And so they are able to pattern match better. And the very best venture capitalists can help you listen to your better angels. The best venture capitalist is going to keep you from drinking your own Kool-Aid. And the worst, they're going to mix it and pour you a glass.
Does the space allow for people who are, I don't want to say brutally honest, but are just more equivocal about everything? If you are real, if you really get real in a pitch with a venture capital firm, or you get real with investors or employees, if you're always kind of talking that way, I don't know, is that even possible?
There's a few things I want to say about that. The first thing is it makes me think about a habit I developed as an entrepreneur that I now teach to entrepreneurs here. And
to do or not to do?
to do, and then
Okay.
that's the habit. The habit is to say, to be bold when you say, I don't know. So let's say, Kurt, you say to me as an investor, you say, how do you know that you can reach customers through this channel or something like that for my new
Hmm.
SaaS app or something? And as an entrepreneur, I really like the following pattern. I might say, I don't know, but let me tell you what I think. Or I would tell you the truth. I'm not certain, but let me tell you what I think. And then I'd go into what I think. The reason I like that is I'm acknowledging the uncertainty here. I'm showing you that I'm coachable. I'm showing you that I'm honest. I'm showing that I'm candid, but I'm smart enough to have an opinion, to tell you about that opinion and to engage with you in a debate about the matter at hand. So I feel like now, having asked me that, we should have put that into the paper. But that I think is a very helpful pattern. To say I don't know, in my mind, engenders trust.
What's your hope for the startup world or startup behavior going forward? Just because it is a huge, huge space. It's getting bigger. My question for you as somebody who is in this world and now studies it, like, what's your hope for how it would change?
I hope we have more and more entrepreneurship. We've spoken today about kind of one of the dark sides of entrepreneurship, but the larger story is very positive. There are in our society a few people who get a glimpse of the future that the rest of us don't see, and they decide to work on crazy things that people are skeptical of or even view with derision. And they work on these things, and for most people, for most of these entrepreneurs, these founders, it doesn't work out. But for a small few, they change the world in a way that benefits us all. You can name many of them who have made the world better places, but for every one of those, there's thousands who didn't make it. And so I think as a society, we owe to, even though we kind of think of them sometimes as charlatans or salespersons or whatnot, these entrepreneurs as a population are doing society a tremendous service. And I'm really happy that our modern system in America, at least, and in much of the world now, is supporting entrepreneurs, because we need more of them, especially if we're going to tackle big challenges that lay before us.
Kyle, thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about this. It's really great.
My great pleasure, Kurt. Thank you for having me.